Welcome to the SaaS Revolution Show. I am your host, Alex Theuma, in a hot and sweaty podcast studio in Ramsgate today. I am live with Alex David, who is the COO of Corrily and is in Zermatt. It looks like you're in some sort of hut in Zermatt, but probably nicer than that.
Yeah, a little step up. I'm in a bunk bed situation actually,
Okay.
in a small hostel in the village, but just came back from a nice 7 miler, so it's been a little bit brutal day, but I had some time to wash off beforehand, so nice and fresh for you.
Very good, very good. Well, Alex, great to have you on the podcast. And I guess look, we always start with asking and trying to find out a little bit more about our guests. Obviously, I think we now know that you like hiking, but tell us, who is Alex David?
So, and we'll get into the work side of things, but Alex David loves to travel, loves to cook and eat, and spend most of my time, if I'm not working, which as a startup founder is most of the time to my wife's chagrin, is I like to spend my time outside. So we did a nice hike today to get to a lovely restaurant for our anniversary kind of lunch. So definitely willing to hike for food. Other than that, I live in the Bay Area with my wife and 2 dogs. Grew up internationally. My mom traveled a lot for work, so kind of grew up all over Europe and Asia. Came to the US for uni, and then wound up kind of hopping around the US. Was in New York for a while and Atlanta for a while, now the Bay Area, working in both consulting and inside companies. So definitely like to move around quite a bit.
Very cool. You mentioned you got 2 dogs there. I mean, this is probably a question that nobody expected, but I'm sure a lot of founders and people running SaaS companies have. When you travel often, and I think you do travel quite a bit, who looks after the pets? Because this is a problem that I struggle to solve myself. So I want to learn something straight away from you here.
Yeah, let's do it. So I often have to solo travel because I'm hopping around between whether it's investor meetings, customer meetings, and whatnot. So most of the time it's just me traveling. So my wife is at home with the pups. But when we do travel, like for this situation, we have a really nice, it's mostly a dog daycare, but they do have overnight facilities and they love our pups. And so they get to kind of play to their heart's content and also have like a nice cozy room for them to cuddle up together in the evening. So we've been going to them now for a while. We trust them a lot, and very reasonable rate too, which in the Bay Area, having a dog is basically like having a kid as it relates to daycare costs. So finding an inexpensive one is great.
I think there's plenty of options in London. I may need to build my own one here in Ramsgate, as we don't have such a facility. But we'll good to know, and we'll move on. So tell us about Coralie, Alex. So you're the CEO of Corrily. Tell us about why this business was created. What's the founding story there?
Definitely. So it's very intertwined with my own background. And so I'll give a little bit of that here as well. So basically my entire career has been in the monetization and pricing space. So I did my graduate work in it, then worked in consulting for just around 7 years at Simon Kucher and Partners, which is a kind of pricing consultancy. And so did that for a while. I ran go-to-market and pricing at Segment pre the Twilio acquisition. So that's really been my entire career focus. And the original concept behind Corrily when it was in YC was just this understanding around pricing is a really important lever. Lots of startup founders don't really know what to do with it. And A/B testing is really popular. And so could one do a slightly smarter version of testing, but specifically around pricing? Because not to get overly academic, but when you do A/B testing, there's inherently risks with specifically price testing because you let prices out into the market, which you then have to maintain in perpetuity potentially. And so finding a smarter way to do that was really the problem that wanted to be solved. And so, and it's kind of grown from there as a kind of a price testing platform into a full monetization platform. Anything from managing discounts, managing paywalls, managing price points, packages, features, et cetera, et cetera. But it really came from there, and really my kind of background being from more of the advisory place of wanting to make this more tactical, approachable, because a lot of startups can't afford to pay for large consultancies, right? So giving them the power to take control of their own pricing and do something with it was really, really the impetus behind it.
How long's the business been going? Sort of what stage are you at the moment?
Yeah, so YC21, winter class. And then we are a seed stage company, so still relatively early. There's 8 of us, I think 10, 12 with contractors based all over. So my CEO is actually close to you in London. My CPO is in Seattle. I'm out of the Bay Area. And then we have engineers and staff all the way from Taiwan to Pune in India. So all over the place. And 12-ish customers, I think we're at right now. Good runway on ARR and MRR, and so we've been growing steadily. It's worth noting we actually started as more of a managed service, and so being able to help our clients solve those problems, but we realized that there was an inherent limit to the scalability of that model. And so earlier this year, we actually flipped that on its head, and instead of us using our software to help customers, we gave our software to our customers and said, help yourself. That obviously was a complete shift for the business. And it's been really great ever since, just being able to see all the new things that they try and do, all the ideas that they bring to us that we can then kind of productize and scale up.
Very cool. Very cool. With your founders, so you said one is in London, the other one is in Seattle, did you say? Or yeah.
Correct.
How does that work? Like what's good to operationalize that, with having 3 co-founders, but in different, geographies, time zones, etc. I imagine it can be challenging, but maybe you'll say to the contrary, it works perfectly. But like why? How did that end up? I mean, was that like where you guys always were? And how does it work? How do you make that work?
Yeah, I mean, definitely it's a product of COVID, right? We were a COVID company, and so that's kind of how it started. I think, Praveen, my CPO co-founder, he was at Amazon and Microsoft, so he's been in Seattle for a long time now. And then Andre was at BlackRock in London, so he's kind of been there and has that as his home base. He did his PhD in machine learning and AI there, so he's been in London for a long time as well. So we kind of all have our own bases. And don't get me wrong, it's definitely hard. We don't sleep as much as we probably should, but that's the life of a co-founder. But I do think that there are some positives there too. Because we can cover, Praveen actually, though he's based out of Seattle, he travels quite a lot and lives a bit of a nomad lifestyle. But we actually can cover pretty much the entire world in terms of time zones between the 3 of us. And so with one, like our engineering team, basically mostly being in Europe and India, that's well covered. Andre's a very technical CEO. Most of our customer base is in the US and Western Europe, so I can cover that quite easily. And so it does actually allow us to react to things and kind of do the whole follow the sun model as it relates to working and getting things done. So I do actually think that helps with productivity to some degree.
Who covers Linktree in Australia?
That is me. So they start getting up around 1 p.m., I think, my time. So I mostly do earlier meetings with them for their day. And every now and then I'll head down to Melbourne and see those guys, which is always fun.
And you mentioned YC21, and why did you go through YC? Were you a managed service before you went and did the kind of pivot to like SaaS offering happen through that? Just tell us like why you went through it, what you learned, the benefit really to the business there.
Definitely. I mean, God's honest truth, Coralie was created within YC. The idea that actually got into YC was not what we are today. Right. It was like a aggregation of Slack channel stuff originally. And they basically said like, horrible idea, but great team, like come in and figure something else out. So lots of ideas kind of happened within the YC framework, but I think it was both an exceptional experience in it, just having access to the people, the network, the other co-founders that are there, but then also coming out of it, it's a really, really powerful network to be able to tap into. A lot of our early customers are former YC customers or their founders had gone through YC. A lot of easy introductions can be made through that. There's a lot of kind of internal channels to be leveraged there. So it's a really, really powerful network to leverage. And I think, 10 out of 10 would do it again.
Awesome. And off the back of that, you got your seed funding pretty much. So was it you went through demo day and you got the investment on the back of that?
Exactly.
And then further to that, so YC21, we've gone through 2022. You've got to now, so about sort of like 13, pretty good customers. And in I think early 2023, you entered the SaaStock USA pitch competition. So we did SaaStock. We ran our first event in Austin, first big conference in the US. We'd done some smaller events in the US, sort of pre-COVID. And you ended up, and Coralie ended up winning the competition. So just tell us a little bit about why did you guys decide to enter, I guess, first of all?
Yeah, and I will do a quick plug for everyone listening. If you haven't had a chance, go to SaaStock. It's incredible. I think it really speaks, Alex, to both you and the team, just how well it was organized. And I know it's obviously not your first time doing it, but it was the first time in the US. And so I think everyone I spoke to was just incredibly impressed. And I think that most of the SaaS style conferences, we have some going on right now in the Bay Area, they've gotten very, very large and they've become very impersonal. It's really hard to actually connect with fellow founders and really make something meaningful happen, which I love SaaStock for, and so will be a regular attendee moving forward. But back to your original question, I think originally we had no thoughts that we would win, obviously. Like there were a lot of great startups that were solving some really, really cool problems. And I think every step of the way, as we were continuing to advance, we were like, sure, okay, but like that was luck. We're not going to make it any further. But for us, it was always a way of getting our name out there, right? Brand awareness. There's a stage of people that will be watching. We threw a QR code up on our last slide so people could check us out for a free trial. It was really just an awareness play because we never thought that we could win. So that was a very pleasant surprise at the end.
How did you prep, or did you even prep for it? But what would you, in terms of coming in, knowing that I think you were up against like 50 other startups or something like that. What was the process before it actually started?
Yeah, as much as every founder will probably hate me saying this, they can all probably relate. You're always somewhat in a fundraising mode, and you're kind of always thinking about it, refining your messaging. And, obviously as you get much bigger, it gets easier, but especially at the early stages, it's just a process you're always in. And so, we're constantly working through our deck. And so I think that to that extent, it wasn't necessarily prepping specifically. It's more like we're always prepping. We're always having these meetings. And I think this was a good forcing function for let's try out some new material. Let's think through some of the modern things that we've tried. We actually did a full redesign of the visuals of the deck for the competition. So that was a really good forcing function for us. But yeah, realistically at this stage, you're just always kind of in that mindset.
What was either the hardest thing or the most surprising thing, throughout the process, apart from obviously winning it at the end?
I don't know if I would say it was surprising, but something that was really impactful is the judges. I think the judges were kind of a mix of investors, operators, et cetera. And I think it was really helpful just getting their feedback, right? After every time that we were going, the first round, which was a little bit more intimate, not on the stage, they gave us immediate feedback. On the bigger ones, you could easily go up to the judges and be like, what did you think? What did you have to say? Anything you would do differently. So I think it was good tactical feedback, which I really, really enjoyed. And they also had really good questions. And those questions always kind of make you think how is my message being received? What are things I just take for granted that maybe I need to do a better job of explaining? Yada, yada, yada. So I think that kind of thing is just always super helpful because most of the time when you pitch, you don't get that, right? You get a yes or a no. And maybe if you have a good relationship with the VC or the investor, they'll give you some feedback. But, as we all know, they have an incentive to want to be nice to you. So they're not going to give you the harsher, honest feedback. And in a competition like this, it feels like there's less of that kind of barrier. And so it was just very honest, real feedback, which was super helpful.
In terms of the impact to the business sort of post winning, maybe what are some of the things that have impacted Coralie since then?
Yeah, I think just immediately at SaaStock itself, it was kind of hilarious going around and being almost like the belle of the ball for the next couple hours after the competition was done, right? Everyone wanting to come up. Some people wanted to get pictures taken. It was a very surreal experience. But just immediately the introductions that were made, just being able to meet a lot of people, so many people. Sapphire Ventures was there. And so one of the managing partners that was at SaaStock emailed me immediately afterwards as thank you, congratulations, well deserved, yada yada, let's talk. So it was a really good way of just, again, our goal was to get our name out there, which it definitely did. And so I think it was super impactful just in that regard in terms of brand awareness and making a lot of connections.
Amazing. And I know that yourself and the Coralie team, are experts on monetization. Obviously, that's what you do. But I think I also know something that you're really kind of passionate about is company building and and the human element. And you've done that before. You're doing it with Coralie now. So let's talk about that a little bit. So, I mean, given that Coralie is an early sort of stage team, I think you mentioned something like 12 people. How have you gone about, and how would you advise sort of building the right team sort of early on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the building part is really challenging, right? Because I think that when you're a company at scale, right, you can go through the motions, you have your standard hiring process, you have a team, and you have a vetting process that can kind of be standardized and it works and yada yada. I think that if you're looking for someone who's going to perform at that 80 to 100%, which I would say is like the good, that's fine. You're always going to need someone to overperform at a startup, especially at our stage. Like, people can't be performing at 100%. They have to be performing at 150, 200%. The passion of every single person is what drives the company, not just the founders. And I think that's really hard to just like have a standard interview process for, right? Like, one of our senior engineers, Rahul, I think we went through like 100 candidates before we picked him. And I don't mean just like resume reviews. I mean interviews, tests, etc. until we picked him. And it has paid off a lot. Like, I don't think I've ever seen someone work data models the way he does. It's quite literally magic. And so I think that it's just really important to both get the right caliber and drive early on of someone who truly believes that they have an impact on your business and that they actually can do it. Because again, just having someone who's just going to kind of clock in 9 to 5 and do the 100% is just not enough at this stage.
Yeah, no, definitely hear you. I mean, I'd like often though, I guess if people haven't done it before, a lot of first-time founders, probably majority out there, they do make a lot of mistakes, in hiring. Now, you mentioned this specific example with Rahul, and you 100 interviews to find this kind of right person. But what are some of the things that you would sort of recommend in terms of like avoiding the mistakes kind of early on, because they can really, hurt a business?
Definitely, and we've had some of those. I think the big thing to avoid is falling into the trap of like pedigree and names. I think it's very easy to say like, oh, this person went to an Ivy League school, or they went to Oxford, Cambridge, or wherever, and then they wound up going to work at Google, or they yada yada. It's very easy to fall into that path of just saying like, we're going to outsource our testing to just say like, well, they have all these pedigrees, they must be good. And I think that, again, for a normal company, that's probably true. But and again, I don't want to generalize, because I've also worked with some of the people that have that exact resume who are absolute all-stars. But, we had the experience of a couple people who had that kind of background, and they were very used to working a certain way. And that just doesn't always jive well with the way a startup has to work to be successful, right? There is just a lot of late nights, weekends. There's a lot of grit and sweat that has to be poured into it to make it work. That's why it's hard, and not everyone can do it. And I think that sometimes you have to really look behind just what the label is and really see like, what are they actually able to do and what's driving them. And I think that's something we learned the hard way, and we definitely will keep that in mind moving forward.
Speaking of we mentioned Google there. How does a startup like yourself and others listening compete with the likes of Google and others, when recruiting? Like, what are the things that you can do to get that talent, to get the Rahul joining you and not joining Google, on maybe double the salary or whatever?
Yeah, more like triple. I mean, honestly, you can't compete. If someone is comparing you to Google or Apple or Meta, whatever it is, right? I don't think that's really a battle you're going to win. The person you're going to get is the type of person who doesn't want that job. They want to work somewhere where they're not one of many. They are the only person doing this one thing, right? They're the one who gets to actually own their kingdom of what they're given. They have their responsibility, and they get to drive that. And I think, I guess, like, as a founder, it is a bit of the culture that you set that tone. And you're saying like, we're not hiring you as an engineer to just like look at a list of activities and say like, this is this is my daily scrum and these are the tasks that I have to complete today. It's you're telling me what we should be prioritizing in your work stream and you're taking charge of that. And we're going to look to you to be the expert to tell us what needs to be done here. And there are people who want that and people who don't. And generally, I think that will be a bit of a self-selection almost. And you want those people. And so most of the time when we're competing for talent, it's not with the likes of Meta, Apple, et cetera. We're competing with other startups.
Makes sense. And look, I think it would be unfair for me, given that you guys are the monetization experts, to not ask you something around the topic. But maybe perhaps given what you're seeing and what you've done before, what are some of the monetization mistakes or things that SaaS companies are doing, whether they're aware they're doing it or not, right? And then how do you improve that?
Definitely. I think that there's a habit of people trying to hop on trends. And that's not necessarily bad. Like things are trendy for a reason. But I think, PLG was a big one, and that's paid off for a lot of companies. Usage-based pricing was another one that I saw a lot of. And again, that paid off for a lot of companies. But I think the problem is a lot of people jump into it without actually tactically understanding what that means for their business. And so that's probably the number one usage-based pricing specifically that I wind up talking to a lot of founders about, because most of us who have SaaS businesses, we're based on an MRR or ARR model, which from a revenue recognition standpoint requires a certain amount of predictability of that revenue. If you're usage-based and you are charging as a pay-as-you-go model, there's no predictability, right? You're getting paid for however much they use, which can massively fluctuate. I'm not an accountant, so take this with a grain of salt, but generally from a revenue recognition standpoint, that can cause problems. And so depending on how your investors want to value you, et cetera, like those financial metrics need to be considered. And actually switching to usage-based. If you start usage-based, that's one thing. But if you're, say you're a Series B company, you've always done kind of committed contracts that are license-based or something like that, and then you want to switch to usage-based, you have to think through that. And if you're going to do some form of like pre-committed revenue amount in contracts where you have like a pre-committed limit of usage, for instance, then you have to deal with overages or underage. And how do you deal with that, right? Like, are you overcharging people? Do you credit people? What's the right methodology there? And that kind of nuance is something that people oftentimes don't think through, because they just hear usage-based pricing is all the rage. It's like what we should be doing. And so they jump into it. And again, it's not necessarily bad for their business. They just don't necessarily think through all the caveats. And that's, I think, a big part that I wind up seeing a lot of. And then also, just to be fair, and I know people like Kyle Poyer have talked about this a lot recently, but the thing with usage-based is, as much as that means you're tracking value as it goes up, if someone wants to stop paying you, they will just stop using you, and then there's no more payment happening. And we saw that a lot earlier this year, and kind of as everyone had to start tightening their belts. Well, I have no committed contract to you. I can just stop using you, and then I can stop paying you. And so you saw people, the companies that were usage-based were hurting a lot. And they had to get quite creative quite quickly to kind of shift some things around contract-wise to be able to keep revenue coming in. So there's a risk there, right? So it's worth thinking through.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And let's move into the quickish fire round. So I'd like to know what one thing has moved the needle the most for you in your career.
And this might wind up being a theme, but not getting too stuck in your ways. I think that, if nothing else, COVID was a great example of things can change really quickly, and you just kind of have to roll with the punches and adapt. I think that's something that growing up, moving around a lot, I had to do a lot of, but in consulting too, right? Like you never know what your next project's going to be. You kind of have to hit the ground running and learn a whole new business in a few weeks to start being the expert on it and advising a customer on it. So I think just kind of being able to roll with the punches is probably something I've gotten quite good at doing. And especially as a founder, where things can change at any moment, you kind of just have to know how to roll with it.
What's the best advice you've ever received?
Probably not to think more than like a quarter out, if we're talking like business advice. And again, it kind of sticks with that like roll with the punches thing, but like you can plan an 18-month timeline and all those roadmaps, but things can change so quickly, even at big businesses, that like really planning for more than a quarter or thinking too far in advance it's very easy to kind of get into that mindset of just getting stuck in this process of like, well, if this happens, then this can happen and this can happen. Yeah, but if any one of those dominoes starts to fall in a different direction, then, what happens? So not to get too stuck in kind of that long-term thinking.
Yeah, and funnily enough, I mean, or not so funnily, and I'm sure many other people were in the position just before COVID, I'd finally got a 5-year plan together for SaaStock, and then it was just ripped up within days. So that was unfortunate. Biggest failure you've made and lesson learned?
Biggest failure is probably hesitating to get into the startup world for too long. I think that I was always plagued by a lot of self-doubt around the idea of like, you see these startup founders, and there's a lot of survivor bias in the startup world, right? Like you don't really hear about the founders who have failed. You hear about the ones who are successful, and you see all the things that they've done. And so you compare yourself to them and you're like, well, I'm not that, right? Like I could never do that. And so I think that I hesitated to go into that space for a long time because of it. But, maybe that was fine because I learned a lot in my career. And by having held off, I bring a lot more experience to the table than I otherwise would have. And I think that part of why we are having the success that we have is that none of us are, college dropouts or first few years in our careers. All of us have had careers, and we're kind of bringing that weight to the table of, 10-ish plus years of work experience and really bringing that to the forefront in what we're doing.
What's the hardest thing about being a COO?
I think it's that you're just managing a lot of hats, right? Like day to day, it could be I'm our CFO, I'm our CRO, I'm our CMO, and it's just kind of the context switching, which can wind up being very inefficient just in terms of getting things done. But at the same time, you are that kind of multi-pitch hitter. You just kind of have to jump around, right? And so I think that it's a tough role to play. But again, given my background, it is the one I'm very comfortable doing. So it's hard, but it's also very rewarding because you get to do a lot of things and you get to learn a lot, which is fun.
Do you have a favorite business book? So what is it and why?
So I'd have to probably throw in Monetizing Innovation. Madhavan and Georg did a fantastic job with that book. And I'm really excited for the sequel that's coming out hopefully later this year or next year. And I do think that it really captures a lot of the essence around how to monetize around a product properly. I think High Output Management is probably up there too, right? That's a classic, but it's a really good one to really think about like how do you manage people, and that managing people is in and of itself a job, something that you should take seriously, think about seriously, and actually work at, not just something that's like a responsibility that like, oh, I guess I should have a one-on-one with this person every now and then, right? Like it is an actual part of your job. And I think that book does a really good job of thinking through that and just talking about it.
You joined the SaaStock founder membership sort of earlier this year. Can I ask sort of like why you joined? What's the value for somebody like yourself?
Yeah, I think what really appealed to me is that we're actually a bit of an outlier in that most of the SFM group is more on the bootstrap side. And there's a lot of bootstrapping that happens there. And I think that, especially coming from YC, which is very venture backed, and you have a lot of kind of the stories, especially in the Valley, are very venture focused. And so I think it's really useful to tap into a group of people who think about things just totally differently, right? Like the way they think about scale, the way they think about speed and operating, it's very much around that bootstrap mentality. And again, it's, none of the members that I've met or that are in my circle in particular are young, right? Like these are experienced professionals. They've had a business career or two, and they're leveraging that to really build now their own business out of. And I think it's really, really informative, and it just helps me think in a different way, which can be very powerful.
Well, we're glad to have you as a member. And thanks for sharing that. Alex, we come to the end of the podcast. Like, where can people find you online if they want to reach out sort of personally, and also Coralie as well?
Yeah, Coralie.com, nice and easy. And then Alex David on LinkedIn. I post quite frequently. We have a blog that we're running. We do monthly webinars and things like that. So I'm very, very active, very responsive on LinkedIn. If you ever want to get in touch, shoot me a note.
Awesome. Well, Alex David, thanks so much for taking time out for your, I think, what is your anniversary, not business anniversary, but personal anniversary in Zermatt. And it's a good job at the time, the hiking, right, as well. Really good to speak to you. Thanks for sharing with the SaaStock community. Congrats on all the success so far. Looking forward to seeing, where you guys go. Thanks so much, Alex David, CEO of Coralie.
Thank you, Alex, and I'll see you in 40 days in Dublin.
Indeed.